Hey there, guys. This is John O'Connor, and welcome to Code Your Face Off Live, Episode 6. Code Your Face Off Live is a weekly radio YouTube show where I keep calling it a radio show, where I talk about general topics in programming, Android front end, other more general topics as well. Today we're going to continue from our last episode, Episode 5, where we're building on top of our Astronomy Picture of the Day app. And today we're going to talk about activities and fragments. I'm going to change up the style a little bit. We're going to kind of stick with one topic for today because it seems like that's pretty much all we can get through anyway. So what I'm going to do today is we're actually going to refactor our Astronomy Picture of the Day app to use fragments rather than activities. And I'm going to show you some of the design ideas, the design considerations when you're picking an activity versus a fragment. I've heard a lot of talk lately. I've been talking to a few people, and they've been saying, oh, I've heard that you should only use fragments. You shouldn't use Android activities. And that's not really true. That's actually, I disagree with that entirely. It really helps to kind of understand where activities came from and where fragments came from before you make a decision, because they really do have two completely sort of separate use cases, right? So I'll start out with just a quick couple of definitions if you're not too familiar with it yet. Let me see, yeah, let me get to that link there, Wayne. It's on top of the, my bad, guys. You know what? I'm going to send you over to the Code Your Face Off Live site there, bud. We got a few people on today. This is cool. Yeah, here you go, Wayne. I'm sending you the link right now. So yeah, I'll talk a little bit about what activities actually are, and then I'll talk a little bit about fragments, because fragments really they were a solution to a problem that activities couldn't solve, right? So when Android first started out, when you started out with Android version 1.0, the way that you represented a single screen on your application was with an activity. So if you think about, starting at a login screen, then going to another screen, or like in our Astronomy Picture of the Day app, we start out with a, cool, good, yeah, glad you got it, bud. Yeah, so when we start out with our Astronomy Picture of the Day app, we start out with a main screen that gets the initial image and shows a name at the top. And then we switch over to another screen that shows the details. And those two screens initially in Android would have been done with an activity. The activity kind of starts up all that stuff, right? And that was kind of it's got kind of an elegant way. You use something called an intent to start up these activities. So that's the basic idea. Anytime you want to transition from one screen to another in your app, you use these intents to kind of switch between it, right? And this was a useful thing. This was a pretty elegant solution to a problem that's fairly difficult to solve. But it came at a cost. In activities, you can only ever have one per screen. That's kind of how they were defined. And there were a couple of issues with that. Mainly, the biggest ones that you would notice if you were developing apps in Android prior to the introduction of fragments, you would develop, let's say, a map, for example. The map needed to access stuff about your application. It needed to access things about the activity. And so the way that Android did that was it required you to extend a map activity, right? So if you wanted to use a map in Android, you had to use a map activity. And if you guys remember back to your Java and to your Java world, anytime you extend something, you can only extend one class at a time. So if you extend map activity, that's it. You can't extend any other kind of activity. And the problem arose with Android because there were a few pieces of code that needed to have their own activity. A list view is a good example. So if you wanted to display a list, you actually had to use a full list activity in order to do that. And so what you would encounter is in Android, if you wanted to have a map and then maybe have a list next to it, or maybe a map on top and show a list of items underneath, maybe the waypoints or the points of interest that you're looking at on the map, you actually couldn't do it. It was pretty much impossible to do because you needed the map activity to show the map, and you needed the list activity to show the list, and you couldn't extend multiple activities with the same main activity that you wanted to use. So your activity couldn't extend this map activity and the list activity at the same time. And this was a pretty big limitation. I mean, you had, in a sense, a whole set of apps that you could not build because you couldn't have a map and a list in the same, basically on the same screen at the same time. And there are other examples of it as well, but that's the one that was, for me, the most interesting and the most obvious because I had it actually happen to me where I needed that list and map in the same place, and I just couldn't do it. Android didn't have the ability. So there was a pretty big problem with using just activities. And back then I thought, you know, it'd be great is if you could take one big activity and just embed a couple of smaller activities inside of it, right? So maybe I can embed my map activity and my list activity all within one screen, right? And that would be great if I could do that. In Android 3.0, which was Honeycomb, they introduced that ability in the form of a fragment. So a fragment is essentially a mini activity that the mini activity you can embed inside of another activity, and they call those fragments. So with fragments, with the introduction of fragments in Android 3.0, now you can have a map on one side and you can have a list on another side, and it would all work. It all be pretty. It all actually work pretty well. So that was kind of cool. I was pretty excited when fragments came out because it was this. There were this class of problems that I knew were very difficult or impossible to solve using just activities. And then I found out that Honeycomb Android 3.0 was only going to work on tablets. So I was working on phones mostly at the time. I had to actually wait until Android 4.0, where they merged the tablet line and the phone line into a main trunk, 4.0. And that's when we finally got fragments on your mobile phone, right, on your device. And it's kind of interesting, you know, it seems like they should have had them earlier, right? Android 4.0 doesn't feel like it was all that long ago. Most phones are still in the 4 line, right? They're still on the Android 4 major version. So, you know, it's kind of interesting that fragments are, you know, in the scheme of things, relatively new, but they're very valuable. So that's kind of the landscape of it. That's what activities are versus fragments. And that should give you an idea of what kind of design considerations you want to make. So if you're thinking of, you know, an Android app, right, you're thinking of building it, and you're sketching out what your screens are going to look like, right? Let's say you're using an app like My Balsamic, and you know what we'll do is I'm just going to pull that one up because that's the one that I use myself. It's an app called Balsamic, and you can get to it at mybalsamic, mybalsamiq.com. I'll go ahead and share my screen, and I'll just show you guys this. And I'll give you just a little example of if I were to design an app from the beginning, what kind of design considerations I'd have to make. When would I make the decision to use an activity versus a fragment, right? And that's a decision you're going to have to make at some point if you're building this app here. So I'm going to show you, this is the My Balsamic page, and I'm just going to log in here. I'll use my credentials, keep me logged in for 30 days, sure. And we'll just drop into this guy, and let's create, you know what, let's go ahead and archive one of these projects, and I'm just going to create a brand new project. Now I pay for this service, so I get 3 projects at a time, which is why I'm going to archive one here. Let's go ahead and create a new one. Luckily, the archive can be as full as you want. Let me see. Let's add a new project, and we're gonna do my astronomy picture of the day app. Let me try this one more time. Add a project. Yeah, we're gonna call this APOD. We've got a few people in here. I'm just gonna remove for now. Sorry, I'm building to go out. You guys, you can get access to it later if you want. But for now, I'm just gonna use this. And then let's play around with this, okay? Let's drop right into one of these sketches, and we'll sketch out what we want this astronomy picture of the day app to do, right? We already kind of know because you guys have seen it built the last couple of days, but it'll help to have a sketch. And usually, whenever I start developing an app, I put together wireframes, almost always right away. That's, you know, it helps me think about what I want my app to do. So let's go ahead and start. I'm just going to search for an iPhone up here, just to kind of show my app, you know, in this wireframe. And then we'll start off with maybe a title, right? So I want to have this big title. This is going to be, you know, name. We'll say like Galaxy 5, you know. And then we'll have an image down here, right? We'll have an image, and that's going to be the first page of our app. And then I'm going to go down and I'm going to create a second page of our app, and I'll go ahead and save it. This is going to be our, you know, home page, right? Then I'll go ahead and create another one, and all this is going to do is we're just going to create this second detail page here. Let's clone our mockup, and we'll create our detail page. And our detail page, maybe we'll have like a smaller version of the image up here on top, followed by the name and a slightly smaller title size, you know, perhaps like a subtitle size, perhaps. Let's see, subtitle. There we go. We'll say this is the Galaxy 5. This is just the name of whatever our astronomy picture of the day thing is. And then we'll put a little description. You know, we'll do a paragraph of text. right? This is a paragraph of text, contains our application. And by the way, kind of a fun little hack, if you want to get a paragraph of text that doesn't have anything in it, you've seen this before if you've done design work, you'll see something like, they call it lorem ipsum, and it's just basically dummy text. There's a website called lipsum.com, which I use to generate, 5 paragraphs, a word, whatever. I use that to generate my lorem ipsum text, so I don't have to, type it out or find it every time. And it sort of just lets me kind of, drop in something that's nonsense, but still gets the point across. Is what I'm trying to do. So there we go. We've got a little bit of text in there, and that's going to be the description. And I'll go ahead and call this the details, right? Details. Okay. So we've got 2 pages in our app, right? And we have to decide, what do we want to do with this? Do we want this to be 2 completely separate pages, 2 separate activities, as we would say? Or do we want them to be kind of in the same activity and share the space and then switch one to the other, right? Maybe do a transition from one to the other. And that's an interesting consideration. In this app, we could really go both ways, right? If we had maybe a login page, I'll go ahead and, at some point we'll create a settings page for this so we can kind of mess with it. But that's a consideration we have to do here. We have to figure out, what do we want to have inside of this, inside of this app here? How do we want it to function? For this one, it's not straightforward. For some apps, you'll see something that has like a toolbar, right? Maybe something like this down on the bottom. And it toggles between multiple different screens. So maybe we had something like settings, or perhaps maybe a previous APOD. Then we'll have current. We'll have details, right? Let's say we had a toolbar down at the bottom that had that in there, right? How about we do previous and next? There we go. Now tomorrow. That'll work. Yeah, yesterday and tomorrow. So we can see, let's add a nice, we're going to do that. Let's add a feature here where we can actually see yesterday's APOD picture. We'll do that in a little bit too. We'll play with that. Now I have this toolbar on the bottom, and now it might make sense for me to use a fragment because I can put this toolbar in one fragment down here on the bottom, and then I can put this whole top section in a different fragment. And when I click on a button, I can actually keep this down here on the bottom, and I can just switch out the view in the fragment from this to, say, the details page. So the way that fragments work is they let you define these regions of your screen. Like let's say I have this region right here in my screen, and I'm just going to move this back. Let's see, send 2 back, and then bring 1 forward. Right? Let's say that I had this region of my screen here. This is my fragment region, right? This is going to be my content region, I'll call it. Right? So this is all my content region. And that's going to be represented by a fragment that gets switched out. I switch between fragments here. I switch from this guy right here to this guy, the details. So that's what my content fragment's going to contain here. I'll stick the content fragment here, just so we can get clarity. And I'll make sure these wireframes are available to you guys so you can see them later on. Maybe just get a feel for how something like this might come together. And by the way, the design that I'm making right now, where we have this content area on the top and this little toolbar area on the bottom, that's what we're going to do today, right? We're going to modify our Astronomy Picture of the Day app to be a more clear case of using fragments. This was a decision that I just made, right? This could easily have been done with activities as well, and there's really not a correct way to do it in this case. Sometimes it's an obvious choice to use a fragment. Sometimes it's not so obvious, and you get to make that decision yourself, right? Anybody that says that you should always use fragments, I completely disagree. I think sometimes the activities are ideal. So, don't let anybody tell you that you should do it one way or another. They're wrong, basically. And yeah, I'm opinionated, but yeah, that's my opinion there. So, all right, let's go ahead and move this to this side. Okay, so we've got a little feel for how our app's going to work. We've got this toolbar that kind of stays all the time, and this content fragment up here that switches between the home page and this details page. So that's what we're going to do with our fragments today. That's how we're going to refactor our app. So if you want, go ahead and pull up the Astronomy Picture of the Day app, and you guys will see. We've got the code up on the website. There's if you look in the description for the YouTube video, you'll see the location where you can download this code. It's just hosted on GitHub. Let me go ahead and switch on over. Let me switch you guys over to the my Android Studio here. Let's see, Studio. There we go. Yep. So you guys are going to drop in Android Studio. You're going to download that astronomy picture of the day, and we're going to just start. So right now you can see we have it structured as 2 activities. We have this main activity and we have this detail activity, right? So that was how we structured this app initially. I'm going to go ahead and back out the changes that we had from last time. I'm actually going to go ahead and just, I'm going to bring us back to the state we were before we messed with the, data types, right? We were kind of messing with data last time. I'm going to just back us out of that. Let me see if it runs. Maybe if it runs, we'll keep it, right? How about that? Let's see if it runs, we'll keep it. If it doesn't run, we'll go ahead and ditch it. Let me get us started here with a nice little Genymotion emulator. That'll work. Let's start. I'm going to just share with you guys my entire screen. That way you don't have to think about what I'm doing here. Yeah, there we go. Oh, yep. And then we go back into Infinity. You know what I'll do is I'll move it off to my little side screen here, and that way you guys don't have to see it. All right. So here we go. We got our Genymotion emulator up. We're going to continue here. Let's just try to run this the way it is now. If it works this way, then we'll just keep it this way. Don't think too much about the data part yet. You know, we walked through how we did that in the last episode. So we're more interested now in refactoring this thing into fragments from Activites. Come on, Genymotion. You can do it. You can do it. By the way, this is an Android emulator, Genymotion. If you guys don't know this already, Android comes built in with an emulator that you can use right away. That's part of the Android software developer kit. But it's not great. It's kind of slow sometimes, and it's always been a little bit of an issue. This company, Genymotion, that's Genymotion, they make their own emulator that runs pretty fast. I've always liked it. So that's the one that I kind of use for my own work, just to do quick tests and stuff like that. We're waiting for this thing to build down here. Gradle build. Okay, it looks like the build worked. We'll see if the app actually runs, and if it does, I can't remember if I left this in a useful state or not last time we talked. So let me try this here. Yeah, there's our little. Okay, looks like it still works. Here's our giant squid and the flying bat, and we hit the details, and it's going to take us over to a separate activity. And you'll notice the way that this kind of looks, right? It starts out with this one screen, and when I hit details, it sort of fades it up into another. If you were using an Android app or a hardware device, you would see that slide be more consistent. And that's how activities are transitioned between, right? This is basically an entirely separate piece of the app, an entirely separate screen. And when I hit the back button, it takes me back to the previous screen. And these screens don't share any space, right? These screens don't have any space that share between them. If I had a toolbar down here and I hit this details page, the toolbar would now be gone, right? It'd be completely gone. Sometimes that's desirable. In this case, it's not what we want, right? We want to create this little toolbar that lets us go back and forth in time. So let's go ahead and think about how we want to do this. So the first thing we're going to do, let me get a commit in here. And by the way, if you're not using Git, you should. You'll be using Git if you use this guy. You know, make sure you commit your work. And I'm going to go ahead and I already just committed it right now. I'm going to push it up to GitHub here. And that way you guys have access to the latest. Yeah, so that'll work. So we're kind of got a starting point. So how do we refactor this? What do we do to start refactoring this into fragments, right? How do we even start? Well, luckily, fragments and activities are fairly similar to each other. Let me go ahead and get rid of some of this old code in here. This was part of our asynchronous task lesson or discussion a few weeks ago. I'm going to get rid of some of this code stuff because we're going to be doing a little bit of copy paste here. We're going to be taking some of the stuff we have from our activity and we're going to be dumping it into the fragment, whichever fragment should be handling that information, right? So just to refresh how it works now, we start out with a main activity, right? And this main activity is what displays the name, the detail button, all that stuff. It has a layout activity_main.xml, which looks something like, let's see if it'll actually render today. Render, let me try. Seems like it wants to. Let me see if I can get us a nice dark. Maybe app theme. How about that? Let's try it. No, I've not been having too much luck lately with this thing. Let's try the base theme. No, oh well. You know what? Basic gist of it, you've seen it over here. We have a text view up here, an image view down here, and a button up here on the top. And what we do is when we click that button, which is right down here somewhere, there's the button. When we click on that button, this detail button, it's going to load up, oopsies. It's going to load up our other activity by using this intent. So you see right here, this is the detail button. And when you click on it, this click listener fires. It creates an intent, which is how Android transitions from one activity to another. It says the intent starts at this main activity, and it drops into the detail activity. We're putting, and we send over data, this title and this explanation, by using intent.putExtra. And then finally at the end, we call start activity, and we pass in the intent. So that's how we go from one activity to another. Right? That's the structure here. And that's going to pull up this detail activity, which grabs the intent that started it and grabs this data that we sent it, the title and the explanation. You can see in main activity over here, we put extra for title and explanation inside of the intent. Over in detail activity, we're now going to extract it by saying get string extra for title and explanation. Right? So a few things that we're going to have to think about when we go from an activity to a fragment. One is, how do we start an activity? Or sorry, how do we start a fragment, right? How do we start this new fragment? And two, how do we pass that data from one fragment to another, right? How do we take the data from our main fragment and pass it along to our detailed fragment? In the activity, use the intent to do everything. In the fragment, we're going to have to play with it a little bit, and that's okay. All right, so where do we start? I guess what we start first is with an activity that's going to contain all of our fragments. Normally, that would be called main activity. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to create something here. Let's just call this entry. This is going to be our entry activity, right? And I'm going to do that just so I don't have to, I want to save my main activity and my detail activity. I like those for, for historical reasons, for purposes right now. I'm going to create this new entry activity, and I'm going to extend activity, right? This is going to extend an Android activity. Can I spell extend? Extends. There we go. And it says it can't resolve symbol. Remember our trick in Android Studio, we hit Alt-Enter, and it's going to give us this little IntelliSense menu, and we can hit Import Class. It's just going to automatically import it for us, which is kind of handy. And now, one of the things about activities is they have these lifecycle methods. We've seen that in our main. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do a little bit of copy-paste here. I'm just going to copy my onCreate. And by the way, if you wanted to do this using Android Studio's generators, that's okay too. You can actually go to File, New up here, and you can create a new activity. We'll say a blank activity. You can also generate a blank activity with a fragment in it. I'm not going to do that. I want to show you guys manually how that works first. And then if you're doing your stuff later, if you get it, you can jump in and do the blank activity with the fragment, right? So you can start an activity here. I'm just going to do a little bit of it manually because I like to show you sort of step-by-step how that stuff goes, right? All right, entry activity. And our entry activity is going to have its own layout because everything in Android here has a layout. So let's create a new activity layout. This is going to be our, oh gosh, I guess we're going to use a layout resource file here. We're going to start it out as a activity_entry, right? And we use a linear layout for now. That's fine. No big deal. We can use a linear layout. And inside of this guy, we're going to want two pieces, right? We're going to want somewhere that's going to contain our fragments. So that's what we're looking for. Basically, this container right here and this bottom container right here. I could embed this little toolbar into the main activity, but I want to make them both separate. I want to make them fragments because I want to show you kind of how you can embed multiple fragments on the same screen and have them be pretty elegant, have them work together. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to just make this top part's going to be one fragment, this bottom part's going to be another fragment, and this top part's just going to be the one that switches out. So let's go ahead and make this top one. We're going to create a frame layout. And in Android, a frame layout is just going to be a layout. I'm going to do the size here in a second. It's kind of like a fixed position layout. All it does is give us space to put our fragment in, right? That's all this is going to be as a placeholder for our fragment. And this is going to be our content fragment. So we'll give it an ID of, let's see, Android ID equals this ID content, right? We'll call this our content area. And then below that, we'll have another frame layout, and we're going to call that our toolbar, right? Now we could make that not a separate fragment if we wanted to, but I'm gonna make it separate anyway. Android ID is at plus ID slash toolbar. Right, so two separate. Now, why didn't I make this just a toolbar class? You'll see that in just a second. I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to put a toolbar in there, but I'll show you how that works as well. So I guess this is also going to include a little section on toolbars too. So yeah, that's kind of cool. But what these are, these frame layouts, they're just the placeholders, right? They're just this block of stuff that we need here. Our linear layout, let's see. We're going to want to make this orientation is vertical. That's right. How about for our width, we're going to match parent. And in our height, we're also going to, let's see, I guess we can wrap content. Yeah, let's do a wrap content. Now for our toolbar, we can make it match parent for the width. But what we want to do for height is make it kind of a specific height. If we make it wrap content, it's not going to be a specific height for us anymore. What I actually want to do is I want to make this a, I want to make this like 100 dp. We'll start with 100. That's 100 device independent pixels. That's what you want to use a measurement for exact numbers in Android, because it means that it will scale the pixels for you. So no matter what device you're on, it's going to share the same amount of screen real estate. And as I did that, I realized that the linear layout's not ideal for this, right? How am I going to say, make this top frame as big as possible, but the bottom frame should only be 100 dp? That's kind of a hard thing to get right in a linear layout, right? You can do things like you can set layout weights, which will allow you to do a percentage of the screen, but it's kind of difficult to do this sort of thing with a linear layout. This is actually a good case for using a relative layout, so I'm going to fix this. I'm going to change this to a relative layout, right? Let's do that. And we don't need an orientation when we're in a relative layout. So you're going to see in a second here what we want to do with the relative layout. We're going to make this one now match parent, but we're going to set it to be above this toolbar. So we're going to position this toolbar, even though physically in the code we're going to put it right above our main content. We're going to tell it with the relative layout to actually sit below it. We're going to say layout above, and we're going to say put it above that toolbar, right? So we're going to stick this frame layout above the toolbar, and the toolbar we're going to say, you know what, we want to peg you to the bottom of the screen, right? The nice thing about relative layout is you can tell it relative to the screen, relative to this other view, relative to something else on the screen, like a button or whatever. Put my stuff there, put it relative to something else. So let's do this relative to the screen. We'll say layout underscore align parent bottom, or actually, yeah, align parent bottom, that will work. So we're going to stick it on the bottom, it's true. And we're going to also put this parent center, right? We're going to, I think it's center. You know what we want to do is actually we want to center horizontal is what we want to do. That's how we're going to do this. So it's going to center it horizontally in here. It's going to put it on the bottom of this view. And since it's full length, it's going to match the parent width anyway. But I like to still just be explicit and say, okay, center it horizontal anyway, just in case. So these two placeholders, this is our toolbar. I'm sorry, this is our toolbar, and this is our content. And by using the relative layout, we've actually inverted how they're really displayed compared to the XML, but that's okay. So that's it. That's all we're going to do with these frame layouts for now. Now what we need are our fragments, right? So we've got this entry activity. Let's just go ahead and say frame layout. Will give us some space to actually grab this thing, right? Frame layout, content, and frame layout toolbar. Go ahead and just put it that way. We're going to Alt-Enter to get our automatic import again. And then remember in an activity, whenever you want to inflate this layout, you have to call set content view, right? Set content view. And we're going to pass it r.id.activity underscore entry. Right? Let's see if I got this right here. It's not too happy with me about that R. Usually when you see something like that with R, it's actually because you have a build issue somewhere. Let me just try to do a quick clean and build just to make sure that it's not something silly that I'm doing. Let's see. You know what I did is it's the wrong, it's r.layout, I believe is what I'm looking for here. But it's still not correct. Let's go ahead and let it clean for a minute, and then it's going to rebuild. Yeah, anytime you see an R problem like that, R is an automatically generated file. It's an automatically generated class by Android, where it goes into these XML files, and it sort of builds them up into real objects at build time, right? So that's Gradle, this build system that creates R. If you see R as red, don't panic. You're going to see it everywhere because you use R all the time. If it's R, 99% of the time, it's an error in one of your XML files, right? So if this doesn't build, if this isn't what I thought it was, then it's possible that maybe I have an error in my XML. Maybe I have a bad tag somewhere. Almost always, almost 100% of the time, this R issue is going to be because your app is not building properly. Interesting, or rather, because your XML is not correct. All right, let's see. We've got a R doesn't exist. Our detail activity uses or overrides the deprecated API. Yeah, we're gonna have to debug this just a tiny bit. I think I might already have an idea of what's going on here. Let me go ahead and dump this into the correct package. One of the things about Java in general, and Android, you'll see this in Android because it's based on Java, is that these folders, these packages, make a difference here. This view is kind of ugly, and this may not even be the view that you have. Remember, you can change your view of your files right up here on this left menu. If you can see that, there's a left menu there. It says project on mine right now. If I drop it into Android, now it's going to be pretty obvious what I did wrong. I had this entry activity outside of this. I didn't have it inside of my APOD application anymore. I had it inside of experiments, and that just didn't work. As soon as I moved it into the experiments.apod, now my R file is visible. So in general, that's not going to happen to you. It's pretty rare that this is actually the first time that it was that kind of mistake that I had that caused my R not to work. Keep in mind, R is just a generated file, and it has to be visible. It has to exist, one, and it has to be visible to your application or your activity. So yeah, some things to think about if you're trying to debug this R problem. So R layout activity entry, that's perfectly fine. And we're going to go ahead and set our content view here. We're going to set it to a find view by ID, r.id.content, right? And that's just how we're referring to in our activity entry. That's how we're referring to this specific ID, if you'll recall. Right? We're referring to this frame layout. All right, go back to entry, and we're going to say our toolbar, the frame layout, find view by ID, r.id.toolbar. Right? There we go. We've got those two, and now we're going to kind of change it up a bit. So we've got our activity built here, and we've got our frame layouts, but we're not doing anything yet. We don't have anything to display inside of these frame layouts. So this is where we're going to start thinking about creating our actual content. This is where we're going to start creating our fragments. So let's go ahead. Let's right-click on this guy. I changed it to the Android view for now, so you can see how that worked. You might have already been there. If you aren't, it's up on this top left menu again. Let's right-click here, go to New, and this time I'm going to just generate a fragment right here, a blank one. Let's see what Android gives us by default, right? Let's try this. Let's create a new blank fragment. We're going to go ahead and call this, let's call this main fragment, right? And do we want to create an XML layout? Yes, we do. We're going to create our own layout for this fragment. It says include fragment factory methods and include interface callbacks. I'm going to include both of those, and we can talk about it, right? I'll tell you, what we need to see in here, what you might see, and what you will encounter if you use this. So, okay, let's generate our main fragment, right? And it generated a bunch of code here for us. You see this main fragment extends fragment, gives us these argument parameter names, right? These are parameters that you would pass into the fragment. And then, it gives you this kind of an interesting boilerplate code. The reason that I don't like to generate this very often is because if you're new to this and you see all these different methods that get generated, on fragment interaction listener, on detach, on attach, all this stuff. There's a lot there you're just not going to use right away. So, you know, it gives you, the boilerplate stuff is good, but sometimes it gives you a little too much. So, you know what, let's go ahead. I'm going to undo this. I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to create a fragment for you manually today. You can use the fragment generator if you want to, and I'll talk through all those methods that came up. But I want to actually show you by hand how to do this. Let's see. Let's view the usages here. Fragment main. Yeah, let's get rid of that. I don't care. Let's delete this guy. And we're going to delete the layout as well. Let's go to the layout and delete the layout too. Fragment main. And I'm going to create these manually for you guys, all right? So let's do that. I'm going to just create a new Java class. It's going to be called main fragment. And it's going to extend fragment, right? Android.app.fragment. There's also another one you'll see down here, Android.support.v4.app. And that one gets kind of confusing for people. They're like, which one do I use? Do I use the Android.app or do I use the support.v4.app? And what does the .v4 even mean, right? What is that stuff? So let's see what it auto imports first, and then I'll explain the difference. Yeah, it gives us this option. Which one do we choose? First big choice we have to make here. So like I had mentioned earlier in this video, or earlier in this discussion, Fragments didn't come around in Android until Android 4.0, which was actually API level, and I'll tell you right now because I have it in a GitHub gist that I refer back to pretty regularly. Let me see, and you guys can get access to this as well. I think it's the gists, gist.github.com. Let me get rid of that here. And I'll show you what these Android version numbers look like, right? I have a little table here that I use that one of my, Dan, one of my students put together that I really liked, so I put it on GitHub. If you want to get access to it, I'll make sure to include it in the video link. But yeah, this shows you, when we're talking about Android, we have two things we talk about. First is this Android version number right here. And then second is the API level. And this you'll see at version number 4.1 corresponds to API level 16. Now in Android in the developer system, when you're looking at developer code, this API level always refers to, or rather the version, when they say version like .v4, they're always referring to this API level. So fragments weren't introduced in Android until Android 4.0. But the guys who made Android, Google, wanted to include older devices as well. They wanted to say, hey, we want to use fragments. We want you to be able to develop an app with fragments and use it in previous versions of Android. So they created the support libraries. And the Android support library for fragment, whenever you see .support.v4, let me see, .support.v4, that means that this type of fragment, the support fragment for v4.app.fragment, that'll work all the way back to API level 4, which is Android 1.6. And as you can see, that came out in September of 2009. Not a whole lot of devices using it 6 years later, almost to the month, 6 years later, September of 2015 right now. So yeah, it's very rare to use it. So this is a very safe bet to say that most devices, and it's probably in the 99% range nowadays, will be able to use your code. They'll be able to use your app because the support library goes all the way back to v4, Android 1.6. If you want your fragments to go back to Android v4, in fact, if you want them to go back in history, v4 or above, you can use the Android support library right here. You can use the support version. If you don't care and you just want to go back to where fragments were first introduced, which would have been Android API level 14, right? Then you can use the regular Android app fragment. And if you look at the Google documentation, on the Android site, there's a distribution. They have actually a little graph where they'll show you what platform is popular right now. So they'll show you, Android 2.2 Froyo, 0.2% of devices have this, and many have less than that. They don't even show any that have less than 0.1%. Majority of devices on Android 4.4, that's KitKat, 39.2%. 15.9% on Lollipop with 5.1 additional. So about 21% here on Lollipop, Android 5 and above. So this is a good way to make a decision for yourself. which libraries do I want to support? If you go back to support v4, you're supporting almost every device out there so far, right? There's also a v7 library as well, and if you look at the version numbers again, some of them will go back to v7, which is Android 2.1. Again, this is 2010 of January, 5 years ago, a little more than 5 years ago, as of right now in this moment. This is September 2015. Yeah, you're going to be able to support pretty much anything. My app for APOD, we're going to try it 2 different ways. I'm going to make this one a fragment, and then I'll switch it to the support fragment. There is a slight difference, and it's only in that you have to get fragments and get the fragment manager, which I'll show you in a minute, in slightly different ways. So we'll talk about that in just a second. Okay, so the main fragment extends fragment. Now, if you recall in an activity, we mentioned it briefly before, activities all have this thing called a life cycle, right? So Android activity life cycle. Basically, there are ways that you can hook into an Android app as it's starting up, right? As it's doing stuff. So you can say, you know, this Android app activity, once it's created, you can actually do stuff when it's created. Here's the activity lifecycle. So when an activity is first launched, the first thing it does is it calls its on create method. It says, okay, do stuff when I'm being created, then do stuff when I start. If I get paused, do stuff when I resume. And there's all these lifecycle methods will get you down to activity actually running, right? So fragments have the same thing. They have a life cycle. They have these methods. In an activity, when you want to create a view, you do it in the onCreate method because you're saying, I need to get this view, set up my listeners and all that stuff. Everything will run in onCreate before your app actually starts up. In a, do we need to import support vFragment activity? Yeah. So the import for support fragment, Kevin, and Kevin's asking, don't we need to import the Android support v4 app fragment? We don't, actually. We only need to do that if we want to support back to Android version 4, API level 4, which is version 1.6. If I wanted to do that, I could. I could do this as a different fragment. I could do it here and say support v4 app fragment. That's a choice you get to make. If you don't want to support back to v4, if you want to say you have to use Android 4 and above, that's perfectly fine. Most devices are still on Android 4 and above. It's very rare to find anything in the 2 line anymore. So I'm okay with using myself just the regular Android fragment. As I'll show you in a minute, there are actually a couple of nice things about just using the base fragment. Eventually, this support library is probably going to go away anyway. It's there for backward compatibility. So you make fragments that are backward compatible by using that support library. You make ones that are current by using this fragment library. All right, so what we want to do here is let's create an onCreate method, right? So what's the fragment activity? You know what? In this case, we don't. We're going to do it manually. Yeah, we don't need to worry about fragment activity yet. We will in a minute when we want to get the fragment manager, but I'll show you that. We'll talk about that in just a second. Right now, I'm just creating my main fragment, and I'll go ahead and create, let's do an activity fragment. This is going to be my main, which shows my content, like my first page. And then I'm going to create a detail fragment now, too. And I'm going to do that one through here so you guys can see the difference between the two. Let's go ahead and create our detail fragment. Right, and it's going to create the XML. So let's see what our detail fragment looks like. It just has a text view and a frame layout, and that's it. It doesn't do anything else. It's got this little context here, this tool's context that points to the detail fragment. It's not necessarily a requirement, but it's recommended to put that in there, right? That just tells your Android class when it creates the frame layout, here's the context I'm creating it, right? So let's start out. We're going to create our layout for our activity, or for our new fragment, for our main fragment. But you know what we're going to do is it's actually basically the same as our old main activity, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and copy paste. I'm going to do that. Let's copy and paste this guy. Let's call it fragment_main. Yeah, let's do that. I'm okay with this. And for the context, here we go, we're in fragment main. And for the context, I'm going to just give it a context of main fragment, right? Aside from that, I've done nothing else. I didn't need to do anything else, right? this fragment main is just going to exist. So now it's going to have the same layout as my other main activity. So let's go ahead and see. Let's go back to our, so first thing we have to do, first thing we did in our activity was we set this content view, right? So we have to figure out how do we do that in a fragment. If we pop on down to our detail fragment, let's see, there's going to be a lifecycle method here. There's an onCreate, which it looks like all it does here is get the arguments that are being passed into this fragment. What we actually want to do is use this onCreate view. In Android for a fragment, onCreate view is where you're going to put all of your layout stuff. So this is actually already one difference between activity and fragment is how do you create these views from the XML. In a fragment, this is how you do it, use onCreate view. So let's go ahead and put that in there. I'm just going to copy paste because I'm being really lazy right now and I don't want to spend the time typing when I could just explain it to you. So one of the lifecycle methods is onCreate view. And if you want to see the fragment lifecycle method, you can pull up the Android fragment documentation as well, fragment lifecycle. You'll see all the methods that are available to you in a fragment, right? It's going to look similar to an activity, but it's going to have a couple others. Before onCreate, they have this onAttach. And then they have onCreate view. That doesn't exist in an activity. OnActivity created is one that activity doesn't have. So it's got actually a few more of these that you can hook into. And it tells you in the docs what those are for. OnCreate view is what we're going to use to create our actual view, what we're going to do to inflate, as they call it, this XML. And the idea of inflating in Android, I know I'm going kind of a mile a minute here, but there are a couple of little pieces that you have to understand this background here. Android, when it uses XML files, those files, all they do is, they're just descriptions of what a class will look like. They're just descriptions of this fragment main, right? When Android builds this and it puts it into r.java, it actually converts these into Java objects. And the process of going from XML to Java is called inflation. So you're inflating that XML. So no longer is it XML when you actually build the app, it now is its own Java class as well. And that process there is called inflation. So in our main fragment, you'll see this onCreate view. We have to do the inflation manually. In entry activity here, we use set content view, passed in this layout, and set content view under the hood inflates for us. It says, go ahead and inflate this activity layout and stick it, stick it somewhere in here so we can call find view by ID. So it's already inflated by set content view. In a fragment, we have to do that manually by calling the inflator and inflating that layout that we want. And then we also have to pass in the container that it's going to be inside, right? This will be our, in our case, our content, our frame layout back here in our entry main XML. This frame layout is going to be the container. And that's all that is. It'll get passed into the fragment, so you don't really have to think about it too much here. Let's go back to the main fragment, right? The container is being passed in because our fragment's going to be added inside of our entry activity. So it already knows where to put the container. We put the layout that we want it to have, and I say fragment detail. We actually want fragment underscore main here. And for now, that's what we actually want to do is move a lot of this code from our main activity, our old main activity, over to our new fragment. So that's all I'm going to do here. So I'm just going to copy and paste from main activity. I'm going to put it inside a main fragment. It's going to look very similar to what we had before, right? I'll call this APOD main fragment, right? And you can see here, I just keep the same placeholders. And in fact, I'm actually going to put these inflated items here as well inside of our text views and all this that we had in main activity. Remember, if you recall, we put it in here where we do find view by ID. Now we're going to go ahead and just stick those right inside of the onCreate for our fragment here. And you know what? Let's leave the downloader task in here for now because that's going to be something interesting there too. You know what? No, we'll take it out. We'll actually bring the downloader task over. Let's go ahead and take all that code and we're going to stick it right inside our main fragment. And we're going to put that inside of the onCreate. I think it's a void, right? Public void onCreate. It takes a bundle, right? Let's see. Yeah, it takes a bundle, saved instance state. And we're going to make sure we call our super on create first. We'll pass in our saved instance state. Super, by the way, that's just something that's required for Android is you want to make sure your activity actually does get created or your fragment actually gets created. You have to tell it its parent needs to be created too. And we're just going to dump all that in there, right? Here we go. We're creating this find view by ID. And then you'll notice here we're not really able to get it. Perhaps maybe we can put this inside of our, let's see, we're going to get our view actually is what we're going to do here. So what we want is to grab this view. Let's see. We can call it view dot find view by ID. So what this is going to do is it's going to return the view that actually is attached to this fragment. So it's going to grab essentially this guy right down here. This is what our inflator is creating, and in our on create now we can actually access it just by calling get. You can see a few little pieces that we do need to refactor, but nothing crazy, right? Most of it is still pretty much the same. We'll do a get view here, right? And all those are still just stored inside the same thing. Here, our on-click listener is going to change completely. We're not going to be starting an activity anymore. Now we're going to be making a new fragment. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to comment that out, and let's just put in placeholders here for now. There's that. There's that. Okay, cool. We'll just make a little toast. .make text. Pass in the activity, which is the context here for this one. We'll say, clicked on the detail button, and we'll make it a toast.length long. Right? And the toast message in Android is just that little guy that pops up, a little message that pops up momentarily and then disappears pretty quickly afterward. Let me get rid of this guy. And then our tasks, let's go ahead and auto import. Well, our downloader task is in a separate file, or it's back in our other activity. We're going to add that in just a second. I just wanted to show you that this is where, in our onCreate, this is where all this stuff goes. This is where we're actually going to grab each of those items. And if you don't remember from last time, this find view by ID, passing in the ID here, this is how we grab those Java objects that were XML and get access to them. Now we can modify that position, that object, using this variable mName. So all we're doing is saying that XML file had an ID of name somewhere in there. It had a text view with an ID of name. Go ahead and dump it into this name variable, right? That's all we're going to do there. What else do we want to bring over from main activity? Let's see. We're going to want to bring our set name. Sure, we'll bring that over. Let's bring over our entire downloader task, in fact. We can stick this downloader task inside of our fragment. That's not a problem at all. In fact, this fragment's going to be run first thing, so we actually maybe kind of want to put it in there, at least for now. There are actually other ways to do this too, and there are probably better ways to do it. In fact, I know there are. But we're going to do this for now. Run on UI thread. Let's see, it's having trouble finding that. Let's try get activity.run on UI thread. See if that's in there. There we go. Yep. So activity is what contains the run on UI thread method. Anytime you have to do that refactor, most of the time you just grab the activity. And get activity actually gives you whatever activity this fragment is embedded in. So that's kind of a cool little feature there. Let me see. I have an extra closing brace at the end. That's fine. And there we go. Our main fragment essentially is done, right? With very minimal, relatively minimal refactor, right? That's our main fragment. And our detail fragment is going to do essentially the same thing. Now you can see here why I chose to do this manually, because all I really cared about was an onCreate view. And that's pretty much it to start with. I added some of the other stuff from our main activity, but that's all. Now this detail fragment, look how much stuff it added in here. It added, on create view, on button press, because it's giving you boilerplate, on attach, on detach. We're not really using that stuff. We're not using the fragment interaction listener at the moment, right? We don't really want to do that, at least not at this point, right? We don't want to mess with that stuff yet. That's why I chose to do it manually. Let me just get rid of the stuff we don't need, right? I'll leave the parameters in there just because when I'm going to get rid of this fragment listener, I don't want the fragment interaction listener. I just don't care. Let's do this. We have our saved instance state. Sure, that's fine. In fact, we can probably get rid of this stuff too because we don't need, I don't think we need this factory method here. I think we should be okay with, well, you know what, we'll keep it for now. I'll show you what this actually does here in a minute. We'll use our onCreate, that's fine, onCreate view. Let's get rid of this stuff though. This is just not useful for us at the moment. Let's get rid of that, button pressed. We're going to get rid of onDetached. We're not going to use that. And we're not going to use this interface either. Let's get rid of that too. So now we're back to essentially onCreate view, onCreate, and a constructor for our detail fragment, right? And the reason we have these two separate constructors, right? This is actually using what's called the singleton pattern here. Or actually, no, sorry, the factory pattern. This is allowing us to create a new instance of our detail fragment and pass in some of these parameters. And we actually do want to pass in some parameters, right? We want to pass in argparam1, that's kind of silly. Let's do, we actually wanted to pass in the name, right? So we'll call this name, and we'll say detail, how about that? So name and details, or yeah, details. I'm just going to do a quick rename here, because I like to keep my code kind of clean. M name, and then M details. This is all stuff we're just going to pass into this thing, right? And let's get rid of that. This one's going to be name. This one's going to be details. And we'll say args.putString. So what this is doing here, this is actually creating a separate fragment with these arguments built into it, right? So it's saying these arguments are going to exist. In fact, you know what? We're going to try it without it. I'm going to see how this works, guys. Let's get rid of this factory method too. We may have to bring it back in a minute, but for now, let's get rid of it. Let's just comment it out. We can uncomment it later. We can always uncomment it later. We're still going to use our mname as our parameters. And details, and this is going to be name. This is going to be details. Now that's kind of interesting, right? This is actually a string, right? We're saying get string, and then name, essentially, your name, whatever that string up here was. You're just passing it as string. You see this technique all the time, where you'll use a variable or a constant name here, rather than using a string. And that's because when you use IntelliSense, when you're actually letting Android Studio do stuff for you, you see how that name popped up right up there on the top? I can never get that wrong. If I spell this wrong, it's going to tell me I have an error. But if I do this everywhere, and then I accidentally miss an M or an E, no error, right? There's no error there to tell me something went wrong. So I'm going to use this variable, this constant here. Even though it's still just keeping track of a string, I like to use these constants because it gives me extra help, right? That's this. The IDE is going to give me extra help here. Okay, so we've got our detail fragment now. Let's see if we have any errors. I think it's just going to be in the comments here, which I'm going to get rid of that. No comments needed for now. No comment. All right, and that's basically it. That's our detail fragment. We can move some of our activity detail stuff over there. Same kind of deal. Let's just do a linear layout. Let's just copy and paste it right on in. This is just from our activity detail that we had before. I'm not even going to change it. I'm just going to make it exactly the same. Experiments, the only thing I'm going to change is for the context. I'm going to make it our detail fragment instead of our detail activity. And that's just, like I said, it's an optional thing, but I like to have it in there. It just gives hints for the context, makes it a little easier for Android to deal with stuff. All right, and then that's it. We're just going to close it. We don't need that anymore. Let's get rid of our main fragment, our entry activity. The last thing we need to do is just copy some of these variables. Nothing big, right? Detail name, detail description. Those were in our activity before, so we're just going to do that there. I'm actually going to create these text views, and we inflate them, again, inflated here, but we actually set them inside of our onCreate. That's where we turn it, that's where we take the XML and we drop it into a variable that we can manipulate later. So let's do that in our onCreate right there. That's perfect. We're just going to do that right here. And remember, again, it's getView.findViewById rather than just findViewById. And because we didn't change anything, we just copy pasted from before, these IDs all stay exactly the same, right? So we have details here, get arguments, get string, and then finally, we'll go ahead and fill in these details. And detail name, remember this is a text view, so we'll say set text. We'll pass in our M name. How about that? And M details, detail description dot set text. This is going to be our M details. And I'm getting these from right here. You see how this is right here? That's all I'm doing, grabbing the name, grabbing the details as they get passed into this fragment, and then just setting the text of my text view to those. And that's all. That's it. That's all I needed to do there, right? This detail fragment is basically done. That's it, right? There's nothing there that we're going to need anymore. So now comes, we need one more fragment here, right? We need a toolbar fragment. I think I'm going to leave it out for now. Rather than putting the toolbar on the bottom for today, I'm actually just going to switch between the content fragments. So it's not going to be as obvious. Maybe I'll put something, you know what I'll do is I'll put something in the entry activity to show you that that toolbar fragment area is actually getting used. So let's go entry activity. I'm just going to stick a little text view in here just to show you, just as a placeholder for now. Maybe next week we'll mess with this a little more. Wrap content, wrap content. We'll make sure that that's still in the same, oh, you know what, we want this, sorry, we want this text view to be inside the toolbar area. So we're going to put it right in here in the toolbar. There we go. Wrap content, wrap content. And we'll make the text, let's say Android. We'll just hard code it for now. Okay, there, where the toolbar goes. Right, that'll work. All right, so there we go. We've got that. We've got the little piece of text in there, perfectly good. And let's see what it does first, right? There's one last thing we got to do. I know there's always that one last thing. Anytime you create a new activity in Android, you have to tell Android that the activity exists or it's not going to be able to access it. And the way that you do that is by going into the Android manifest. Now, the Android manifest is basically what tells Android, the operating system, what your app looks like. And you can kind of pick it out just by digging into this XML a little bit. You can see that it starts with an application, and then it has inside of it these multiple activities, right? So we had a main activity and a detail activity. I'm going to comment these out because we're not using them anymore. Instead, we're going to use just our entry activity. So we only need one activity in this application now. Let's create a new activity. The name is going to be entry activity. And the name here refers to the actual class name here, right? This entry activity class name. That's what this activity is. We're going to give it no label, but we're going to set a couple of intent filters, right? If you remember, the intent filters are how Android knows which activity to launch when you start your app. We're going to create these intent filters, and the way that it knows is it has to have an action of main, Android.intent action.main, right? This has to be the main action for this app, and it's going to have to be in the category of launcher, right? Android.intent.category.launcher. That means that this activity can be launched with an intent, right? That's the basic idea here. So these two together, this intent filter section, this is what tells Android, hey, start here. Start in the entry activity. That's the first place you want to start. And because I'm hiding my main activity and my detail activity in the manifest, Android's not going to know they exist. So if I tried to go in and start those activities with an intent, it's going to fail. Let's try to play this. Let's see what it does. It's probably not going to do much, but that's okay. We're going to start small and we're going to build up pretty quickly here. Within the next few minutes, probably the next 10 minutes, we're probably going to have this all ready to go. So it's going to go pretty quickly from this point. Assuming Gradle cooperates and decides to execute its task quickly, really should be okay. Let's see. So we've got our tasks executing still. And as you can see, the fragment and activity, there's not a huge difference between the two in terms of development effort. I think activities are actually a little bit easier to create and to manipulate because they were built into Android in the beginning. Here's our content frame. Here's our toolbar frame. And you can see it's 100 DP right here on the bottom. So yeah, it looks like our activity, it all worked. It actually built and everything. So that's cool. That's great. I'm going to leave this here. And the last thing I'm going to do now is I'm going to drop these fragments into this content view, right? I'm going to start putting these fragments into where they need to go. And this is sort of the fun, the interesting part right here. All right, let's do this. Let's clear out some of our extra stuff here. What we really want to have open is, let's get rid of detail activity, fragment main, activity main. These are all done. We're not even going to use those. We could delete them if we wanted to. I'll leave them in there for now, though. The last thing we need to do now, so at the core of it, every Android app really is at least one activity. Fragments are optional. You don't need fragments. You can make your app work with just activities. But activities, at least one activity, is an absolute requirement. So our absolute required activity is going to be the entry activity. And if we have a single activity, we can now manage fragments, right? We can manage fragments within this activity. So let's go ahead and start messing with fragments a little bit. And I'm going to try getting the fragment manager here. Now, something that you'd asked, Kevin had asked before was like, don't we need to use the fragment activity? And actually, you don't. The fragment manager is built into Android's activities, right? So we could use fragment activity. It's going to give us a little bit of extra stuff there, but the fragment activity is only if you're going back to Android. Remember this support library? You'll notice if we can get this to pull out a little bit here. Let me see. There we go. You'll notice that fragment activity is part of the support libraries. The regular Android fragment, if we're using just our, the regular Android activity, if we're just using android.app.activity, that has fragment already built into it. If you want to go back in time and use fragments with older activities or older apps and older devices, then you have to use a fragment activity here. So that's hopefully that answers the question there, Kevin. Is you don't need to use fragment activity unless you're using the support libraries, then you do. So because my fragment here, because I imported not the support version of the fragment, but just the regular old fragment here, I don't support behind Android 4.0 anyway. So I'm okay with just leaving it as an activity. It's a little simpler for now, so that's what I'm going to do, right? So we're going to call get fragment manager. It already exists in the main activity here. And we're going to say dot, let's see. So the way fragments work, and this, we're going to kind of go through this relatively quickly, but in the near future, I will also do another treatment on this as well. So fragments are all managed by something called a fragment transaction, right? And there's something called the fragment manager that handles those transactions. So a transaction here in this case is a movement from one fragment to another, either creating a new fragment or updating a fragment, something like that. The fragment manager is what allows us to take an activity and to move fragments in and out, right? To switch fragments around, switch between stuff. And they all act on transactions. So we're going to use the fragment manager to create a transaction that will eventually do something, right? That will change us from one to another. Is that why? Oh, is there a bad delay? No worries, pal. Is that why I'm not using AppCompat? Yeah, pretty much. AppCompat's another support library. You'll see that occasionally too. You'll see this AppCompat activity as well. And you'll notice here, it's an Android support.v7, right? V7 support means that it goes back to Android 2.1, the Android 2.1 line, which was Android Eclair, about January of 2010, so 5 years ago. If you're using the V7 libraries, it goes back to there. In this case, I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to use the base Android here. All right, so what do I want to do here? Well, I want to take my main activity, the main fragment that I created, and I want to make that show up in my content area, right? So the first thing I'm going to do is create this thing, right? And let me go ahead and put them up here. There's a fragment here, and I'm going to call this main fragment. I'm going to create another one, detail fragment. In fact, I think I can even take this a step further. No, I'll leave it like that for now. Let's go ahead and import the class. And again, I'm not using support, so yeah, I'll just set the fragment to the main app.fragment, Android.app.fragment. And now I'm just going to create it as if I were creating any other class. And main fragment equals new main fragment. Now I'm going to create a detail fragment. Right? I'm going to start with those two, and then we'll kind of mess with it in a minute, right? So we've got our fragments here, and now we have to create a transaction. We have to display this fragment somehow. To do that, we're going to do this transaction here. So we're going to start out by creating this fragment transaction. And actually, we don't necessarily need to do all that work. I can do it without creating a separate fragment transaction. I'll show you how to do that using this builder pattern. So first thing we have to do is get fragment manager.begin transaction, and we'll just use the builder. That'll work for now. Okay. Now we're inside of a transaction. We can do a couple of things. We can either add a new fragment, or we can replace an existing fragment. I'm going to go ahead and add this fragment here. And a couple of ways we can add, but I'm going to show you the main one that I'm going to use here is we're just going to add this fragment, and we're going to put our main fragment. And for string, it's actually referring to, let's see here. We need to identify first where this is actually getting placed, right? There's an integer that will actually tell us which ID that we want to put this fragment into. So we're gonna start by our add. We're gonna start by specifying first that we want it to go inside of this content frame layout. And luckily, we don't have to use the content object directly. We can just say r.id.content, right? And then we're gonna go ahead and use this main fragment. And I'm gonna give it a tag. The last argument there is a tag. I'm just gonna call this main. You don't need to add a tag, but it's kind of useful if you have multiple fragments. It lets you play with, optimizing how fragments are going to work, right? And then the last thing we have to do is we have to commit every transaction. So if you haven't committed, it's just like any transaction. You have to, hand people the money, and then they have to give you your stuff. And now you're committed, right? You start this transaction, and when you call .add, you're saying, hey, I want to add my main fragment to the content area of my layout here, right? I'll get rid of these just so it's not confusing, because it's just inside of here. Activity entry, this XML file here has this RID content. That's what I'm going for. That's the ID I want. I want to drop it right into this frame layout here. So I specify it. Give me the frame layout right there. And then we're going to drop my main fragment in. We're going to give it a tag, and then finally we commit. And once we're committed, now we can actually view that fragment. So let's go ahead and see if that works. Let's try it. Might take a second here. But the basic gist of it when you're creating fragments is you're using this fragment manager, creating a transaction, and then it's the transaction that will then add a fragment or replace a fragment. It'll do stuff with fragments in there. I got a crash. Let's see what I did wrong here. Must have done something wrong. And it may be that we will have to save the rest of this discussion for next time. Let me clear out some of these no filters. How about that? I'm guessing it's probably okay, unable to start activity, no pointer exception, couldn't invoke, find view by ID on a no object reference. I'm guessing that I just made something silly, kind of a silly mistake. Let me see. Can invoke method find view by ID on a no object reference. So I guess maybe this view didn't exist yet. Maybe I'm doing this part wrong. Maybe I'm grabbing the wrong setup here, the wrong. Maybe doing this wrong. Let me see. I'm going to do a quick Google, and you guys know me. I'm okay with making mistakes and trying to figure out how I'm supposed to do it. Let's go ahead and fragment, Android fragment. Let's see, find view by ID. Let's see what comes up here. I'm sure I've answered this question even to other people before. Let's see. It looks like it says to use get view. I was pretty sure that was the right way to go. Perhaps, yeah, maybe one of you guys have some feedback there. I have to do it after the view is created, right? Yeah. And I believe if we look at the life cycle, this view actually should be created already, because the onCreate view, I believe, gets called right here, right? It gets called before onCreate view, or onCreate does. I'm going to double check that life cycle is going to help us there, right? Let's go ahead and check the life cycle. Let's see, create the view first and then define the items. Okay, I think I get what you're saying there. Let me just double check here, because that's what, okay, gotcha. So do the inflation, yeah, I see what you mean. Okay, so I did do that a little bit backward, that's my bad. What you want to do first, you create the view here, yeah, and then you return it at the end. And inside of here, now you have access to the view. So the view is guaranteed to exist inside of this onCreateView method. All right, yeah, I see that. I messed that up. So let me just take this stuff and let me move it down to, I don't want it to all happen in onCreateView though. I want to just create these here. I still want to leave the other stuff, the set visibility and all that. I still want that to happen up in the onCreate. So I'm going to do that. Let's see if that works, yeah? And all I need to do now is just change this to view instead of get view. There we go. Right. Locking on. Let's try that again and see if we get the same kind of patch. All right, here we go. Should be popping up for us here in just a second. Let's see. Wayne's saying now it's just view.find view by ID. Create the view first and define the item. It's just view by ID. Still got a little error here. Let's see what I got. Set visibility on a null object. Yeah, it looks like I have to put everything related to the views for now. All this beginning stuff. It looks like I have to put it on create view. So that was my bad there. That was a mistake here. I'll go ahead and stick it in there. And I guess it makes sense when you think about it. The view has to be created, and maybe this onCreateView lifecycle method, even though in the fragment documentation, it shows it as being called before onCreate. In fact, they might actually be in parallel with each other. Let's see. No, you know what? I was wrong. It calls onCreate first, and then it calls onCreateView. So I got the order of these mixed up in my head. OnCreateView actually gets called after onCreate. So everything I want to do with the views, I have to do in onCreateView, which, you know, logically, I guess that makes sense, right? So perfect. Let's go ahead and just do that. Let's see if that works. Give this another shot. And hopefully, when we get this right, you guys are going to see the frame, the fragment's actually going to be inside of that frame on the top. We're going to have it existing right above where the toolbar area is. And look at that. There we go. We've got it. Here's the spinner, and here's our separate fragment. So we have our fragment here. This is it, right? This worked. So we have a fragment on top. We have this toolbar fragment here on the bottom, and they're completely separate from each other. We've refactored this view into from an activity to a fragment with relatively little effort. A few little bumps here and there, but nothing too crazy. You know, it wasn't too bad. And our detail button, we can still see the toast. I guess the toast didn't pop up, but that's okay. You know, sometimes I mess up here in the context. Maybe I have to pass in a different context instead. Oh, I forgot to call .show. You see that? It says toast created but not shown. Yeah, that's because I forgot to call .show here at the end. Anytime you create a toast, you have to show it. And that's not the first time I've made that mistake and sat there thinking, why isn't my toast showing up? Maybe I got the wrong context. Turns out I just forgot to show it. So that'll happen occasionally. You know, no big deal there. I just, for completion, I want to see this actually happen. And then the last thing today, I'm going to show you how to actually get that fragment replacing. There it is. Click the detail button. So that worked. And then the last thing we need to do is we need to switch out this content fragment now. We want to switch this out. So we want to switch it from the fragment it is to a detail fragment, right? So I'm going to show you how to do that. It's going to take place inside of our button click listener. So let's go ahead and get rid of this toast. And it's going to still be the fragment manager, right? But now what we're going to do is we're going to create, let's see, I have this placeholder up here for my, I don't have a placeholder for it, so let me create a placeholder for it. Private fragment. This is going to be our content fragment. Well, I'm sorry. How about this one? We're going to do detail fragment. We'll do private fragment. I'm going to create it up here because I want to reuse the memory space here. I'm going to have to keep recreating this detail fragment over and over again in order to get parameters passed over. So what do I have to do here? I have to create a fragment first. So our M detail fragment, we're inside of our enclave. We've clicked the detail button. Now we're going to create our a detail fragment. We're going to make this a new detail fragment. And you'll see here we don't have any arguments, right? That was what they were doing when we had this default fragment. When we have this stuff right here, this new instance. This was actually what you have to do in order to pass parameters into the detail fragment, right? Let me see. I'm actually okay with not using this factory pattern. I'm going to show you another way how to do it. It's a little bit easier than that, I think. So what I'm actually going to do is I'm just going to create the detail fragment. I'm going to say detail fragment dot add arguments, or was it set argument? Yeah, set arguments. I'm going to pass in. It takes a bundle, right? A bundle in Android is just a key value pair. So let's do a content bundle. Content bundle. I think it's maybe just bundle then. We can just create a bundle. That's fine. Args equals new bundle. Bundle, or sorry, args dot put. We're going to go ahead and put string. It's going to be called. This will be title, right? What am I missing here? It says the title is going to be whatever we got here for our text. This was done in our separate view here. So it's, I think M title and M description are the two things that we want to put in there. So we're just going to add these to the bundle, something in title called M title. And we're going to say put string description into M description. You will remember I said we put, sometimes we don't like to do this with text. We like to use a constant instead. I'll show you how to do that in just a second too. It's a simple refactor. And then now I'm going to set the arguments to this args bundle. And finally, let's get the fragment manager. We're going to create a new transaction, right? We're going to, let's go ahead and do an add instead of a replace. Two things we can do here. We can say, tell the detail fragment to replace this content fragment so that it's now the only fragment there. And if I were to hit the back button, it would exit my app. Or I can tell it to add it on top, to layer it on top. And then once I hit the back button, it'll go back to my previous one. We're going to try it both ways. I'm going to show you guys both possibilities here. So we're going to say this goes inside the content frame, right? We're going to put in our detail fragment, and we'll give it a tag of detail, right? And then we'll go ahead and commit, because we have to commit to every transaction here. And that right there should do the trick. That gives us our new fragment that lets us put arguments into it. And then we use our fragment manager add here to actually add that new fragment. Let's go ahead and run it and see what it does. And you'll notice here I'm using the add, right? We're going to try it again with replace in just a second. I'm going to show you the difference between the two. I'll put this up here. And it's possible my detail fragment won't work because I haven't messed with it yet, right? I only just kind of left it where it was. So I think it still needs to have some work done to it. But I hit details, and yeah, it crashed. That's something I kind of expected right now. Let's just fix up this detail fragment really quickly. I know I can do it relatively fast. It's because I'm in onCreate here. I need to be on onCreate view. There we go. Same thing I did in the last problem, actually. Tools. And then put all this stuff below it. And I grab this inflator.inflate line. I'm just going to stick it where the view is. And then I'm going to return v for my view. We'll say v.findViewById all throughout this thing right here. I generally try not to use one-letter variables if I can help it. And here, view versus v, neither one are particularly descriptive, and it's fairly obvious if you're using Android what you're doing there. But if you want to be verbose still, which I recommend, go ahead and switch it out to view, right? So we're going to go ahead and get the arguments and then pass them in there. But let's see if that works. That might actually just do the trick. It might have been just that we needed to put this in the onCreate view method instead. Let's try that. All right, here we go. We've got our main fragment. And let's see if it'll switch to our detail fragment. We'll hit detail, and look at that, it layered it right on top, right? And that's because I don't have a background on either of these. And I noticed I didn't get my data in here yet either. It's probably because I need to do, I need to find a way to get these arguments. Maybe the arguments were null instead of what I wanted them to be. So let's see. Yeah, I'll have to figure that one out just in a minute here. In any case, though, you can see that it layered it right on top. So we actually did get it. If we hit the back button, you should see that whole thing disappear. Shouldn't have done that, but that's okay. Let's see, fragment detail. How about we give this thing match parent, match parent. Let's go ahead and give it a background. Instead of a transparent background, we're going to make it color slash trans. We'll make it white. How about that? Just a white background. And we're going to do the same thing with the other fragment. You have to have a background on these fragments or they're going to be see-through. And what you saw there was a see-through fragment, which was kind of odd. Let's try this now. See if our background, setting our background color is what does the trick here. Let's try that. Okay. And here we go. Let's see if this will pull off. You see, we got a white background now. Here's the toolbar down on the bottom. And if we hit details, switches off completely. So you can see it switched out entirely. Hit the back button. It closed our entire thing. Interesting. It did that. Okay, well, that's the starting point anyway. And you know what I'm going to do is we're going to call that one a day. We're going to say that for now, you know, this is all we're going to cover for today. We did a main refactor from fragments to activities, or from activities to fragments. Next time, we're going to correct this. We're going to fix these arguments in here. So passing arguments from one fragment to another, or passing them from our activity to another, fragment here. You can pass them around either way, any way you want to there. We'll go over that, and then we'll go over a couple of optimizations here to make this better. And I'll show you the difference between an add and a replace. So I'll make sure we have a good example for that next time. All right, so thank you very much for watching, everybody. The code is going to be up on GitHub. You'll see it in the description, the GitHub link in the description of this video. It's also just github.com/sax1johno. That's my repository. That's my public GitHub handle. And you'll find it in my repositories list. It should be called APOD-android. So you'll get access to that. I'll make sure to push that up here just in a few minutes. And yeah, you can tinker with it. Go ahead and play with it. See what you find. See what strikes you there. So, alrighty. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Good seeing you again. And have a good weekend. And, go get your face off. All right. Take care.